In a lot of ways, my taste in horror games and my taste in horror movies follow the same basic set of rules. In both cases, the aesthetics of both the monster and of the world play a huge role in sucking me into the experience. In this regard, the original Alien film from 1979 and 2014's Alien Isolation are both peerless masterpieces in terms of their presentation. They pull out every trick that they can to make sure that you're in a state of constant anxiety even when the titular alien isn't present. However, Alien is my second favorite horror movie, and Alien Isolation is my second favorite modern horror game. And what's interesting to me is that the movie and the game that take both of my number one spots do so because of a common quality. They aren't my favorite because I find them the most terrifying, they're my favorite because I find them the most gripping. In this video, I'm going to do my best to define this quality and to explain why, for horror games in particular, it's by far the most important determining factor in whether I enjoy the game or not. John Carpenter's The Thing is the one horror movie that I hold in higher regard than Ridley Scott's Alien, but it isn't for any of the reasons that one might assume based on its reputation in pop culture. The Thing is probably best known for its body horror elements and the extremely intricate practical effects that were used to show these monstrous transformations that the titular things would undergo once they'd been identified as imposters. And don't get me wrong, I think that these are fantastic and that they make the movie look and feel unique, but they aren't the standout feature of the movie to me. In fact, if I'm honest, in a lot of cases I find these transformations to be a little over the top and campy in a way that can almost make me laugh. The xenomorph in the original Alien movie is far more intimidating to me than The Thing is. It's just completely nightmarish in its design. It's totally psychologically overpowering in a way that makes your heart pound out of your chest in sequences where characters are heading into the unknown. But despite the fact that Alien has a significantly more intimidating antagonist, The Thing has a quality to it that makes it stand out to me as the superior horror movie. There's this early scene in which MacReady, the main character of the movie, plays virtual chess, and it's a really clever way of setting the tone for the rest of the movie, because what's gonna play out over the course of the rest of the film is like an elaborate game of chess between MacReady and The Thing. See, The Thing is an extremely powerful enemy, but it also follows very concrete and predictable rules. It's a shapeshifter that can impersonate people and animals to the point of being indistinguishable from them, even to other animals with heightened sensory capabilities. However, in order to do this, it has to physically absorb the entity that it wants to imitate, and this process is time-consuming and violent. It leaves physical evidence that can later be discovered. So in the beginning of the movie, the Thing moves very slowly. It only attempts to assimilate people who it knows that it can completely isolate. Another one of its powers is its ability to enter a suspended metabolic state, which lets it survive freezing temperatures for prolonged periods of time, and allows it to trick people into thinking that it's dead when it's actually just lying dormant. But perhaps the most frightening quality of The Thing is its intelligence. It's an extremely strategic and patient enemy, and every move that it makes is calculated. Even though I've rewatched this movie countless times, I keep discovering new elements of The Thing's plan that I hadn't recognized before, and every time that this happens, it makes the hair on the back of my neck stand up just as though I were watching the movie for the first time. Here's a great example of a relatively recent time that this happened for me. While MacReady and company are reviewing materials that they gathered while exploring the Norwegian research base, you get a glimpse of a map that shows the physical distance between the American and Norwegian bases. This is an enormous physical distance, such that the odds of somebody just accidentally walking from one point to the other would be close to zero, even if they could survive the journey. As you start to consider this fact, it'll start to slowly dawn on you that The Thing had specifically targeted the American base. It might also start to occur to you that Windows probably couldn't contact any nearby bases by radio at the start of the movie because The Thing had already assimilated those bases. When The Thing drops its subterfuge and reveals itself in a spectacularly gory transformation scene, you realize that the reason that it was willing to expose itself here, despite having been so cautious and stealthy up to this point, was the fact that by revealing itself, it was able to eliminate the only medical doctor stationed at the base. When it's discovered in the middle of an assimilation, it knows that its cover is blown, so it attempts to flee the base to hibernate in the Antarctic snow. When it senses that MacReady is emerging as the leader of the surviving humans at the base, it frames him as an imposter in order to sow distrust among the survivors. The Thing's actions follow very logically from both its capabilities and its limitations, and this is where the magic sauce for the movie happens. You see, when I say that a movie or a game is gripping, what I mean is that it served as a vehicle for my thinking about it as though I was actually there. And that in thinking about it as though I were there, the experience became richer as a consequence. When I watch The Thing, I think about it as though I was a member of the Antarctic research base. I start studying the clothing of everybody at the base to see who has had a sudden and unexplained change in outerwear. I start to think about who, practically speaking, could have been assimilated. Who was alone with somebody who was later discovered to have been an imposter? How long were they alone together? Was that enough time for an assimilation to occur? As I start to chase these lines of thought in my head, my own paranoia and distrust is mirrored by that of the survivors at the base, who, though they all know each other and have well-established bonds and relationships, gradually start to see each other as potential threats. It's this quality of the movie that renders it so infinitely rewatchable to me. I have seen this movie so many times that I'm well past the point of the Thing transformations being frightening, but I still get completely sucked into the feeling of paranoia and dread that McCready and company experience in the movie. I feel as though I'm pulled through the screen to the point that I can almost feel the chilly Antarctic air on my face and hear the howl of a winter storm outside of my window. And it's all down to the fact that it provides me with all of these outlets for thinking about the situation as though I were there. See, I think that it's a laudable goal for a horror movie or a horror game to attempt to be terrifying, and Alien Isolation is one of the most terrifying games that I've ever played. Like the movie that it takes its name from, it uses an unbelievably potent combination of environmental design and lighting tricks to keep the player in this constant state of anxiety even when the alien isn't present. And the alien itself is without a doubt one of the most terrifying horror movie creatures ever conceived of. It looks simultaneously to be part machine, part insect, and part demonic apparition. Its visual design alone is pure nightmare fuel, but Alien Isolation nailed absolutely everything about its presentation. It can move like a silent killer or an unstoppable juggernaut. It sounds like a demon from hell, and its behavior very effectively simulates that of a predator that's doing everything that it can to track you down and make a meal out of you. But terrifying creatures in both video games and in movies come with a gigantic catch. They have to be deployed very carefully so that the viewer or player doesn't hit what I would call terror fatigue. You see, part of what made the xenomorph in the original Alien movie so terrifying was the fact that you don't actually see very much of it over the course of the film. In fact, it appears on screen for a little less than 4 minutes of the movie's roughly 2-hour runtime. This was really smart for a couple of reasons. At the most basic level, it was smart because we naturally begin to fear things less the more familiar we get with them, and the more times you show the alien, the more diluted the psychological impact of its presence will necessarily get each time. Case in point, the sequel to Alien, which is James Cameron's Aliens, has xenomorphs on the screen for roughly 10% of its runtime, and this is just a part of the reason that it's a much less frightening movie than the original. In fact, most of the fans of that film consider it to be more of an action film than a horror film. But here's the other reason that it was smart to limit the amount of alien time in a movie that was called Alien. The more screen time that the alien was given, the more opportunities the audience would have had to notice that it kind of moves around like it's a guy in a costume. This problem becomes particularly pronounced for horror video games, in which you're potentially going to spend hours with the monster. How do you preserve the terror of the creature over that length of time? And furthermore, how do you stop the player from beginning to see through the cracks in the illusion? How do you stop them from noticing, for instance, that there's clearly some sort of video game script running that dictates what the creature can and can't see? Even in horror movies, I find that I'm more drawn to the gripping ones than I am to the terrifying ones because as far as I'm concerned, there's no equivalent sort of decay that occurs over the course of the movie. There's no gripping fatigue that writers have to be mindful of. But in the case of horror video games, this preference is true to such an extreme that I would go a step further and declare it to be objectively the more important quality for a horror game to have. This is true both because of the increased opportunities for terror fatigue that horror games suffer from, and from the fact that the qualities that can make a horror game more gripping can more naturally tie into gameplay elements themselves. Terror in both horror movies and horror games is part of the surface level of the experience. It results from the way that the world looks and feels. But horror games can do something magical. They can give you ways of dealing with or avoiding the monster that can make it seem more real than just its visual design and graphical presentation could achieve on their own. My review system contains a category for just this type of thing. Immersive synergy, or essentially, does the gameplay interact with the surface elements of the game to produce a stronger sense of immersion than just the surface elements do? This is the category that, to me, most effectively separates my favorite horror games from the rest of the pack, and it's the one that most closely tracks with how gripping I would describe the experience. And one of the two games that I'm going to review here today is, to me, by far the most gripping horror game that I've ever played. But terror is, at the end of the day, still an unbelievably important part of a horror experience, and Alien Isolation is without a doubt one of the most terrifying horror games that I've ever played. In the first review that I posted on this channel, I mentioned that I can only think of 3 games that I would give a perfect score in the category of strength of illusion. I'm here to tell you though that that's complete nonsense. There are 4 games that I would give a perfect score. I think it had just been too long since I had played through Alien Isolation. The absolute perfection of its atmosphere and its visual design had just faded from my memory over the last 10 years. It's hard to talk too much about what makes Alien Isolation such a visual masterpiece without starting out by looking at what's so effective about the visuals of Ridley Scott's Alien. The developers of Alien Isolation had access to an extensive archive of production materials from the original Alien movie, which included a lot of the work of concept artist Ron Cobb. Cobb was the creative visionary behind what you might call the industrial realism of the Alien universe. You know, the chunky CRT monitors, the tight and narrow hallways filled with metal pipes and corrugated tubes, that part of the movie's aesthetic. In fact, some of the environments that you get to explore in the game were inspired by designs that were intended for the original movie. The other artistic visionary who's probably more famously associated with the Alien universe is Swiss artist H.R. Giger, whose art style is often described as biomechanical, showing human forms intertwined with elaborate machinery. Giger was the main creative mind behind the design of the Xenomorph, as well as the derelict spaceship that the crew of the Nostromo explore, and the space jockey who presumably piloted that ship. Even though these 2 men are deservingly credited as having largely created the aesthetic of the Alien universe, it should be noted that director Ridley Scott contributed one of its most essential elements: the fact that all of the interior spaceship environment seemed to be filled with this uniform steaminess. It makes light project in these really eerie rays, and it makes shadows have these very distinct hard edges. Scott achieved this by filling the interior sets with incense smoke, and you can see it in just about every interior shot of the movie. So what do you get when you create a world of narrow, pipe-filled hallways and corridors, full of smoke that gives objects very distinct silhouettes, and you place a terrifying creature in those hallways whose visual design intentionally incorporates mechanical elements and whose silhouette naturally camouflages with the environment? Magic is what you get. You get pure, indescribable magic. The claustrophobic interior shots of the Nostromo constantly suggest the presence of the alien. They make you imagine it hiding behind every corner. This is especially true when strobe lights are added to the environments. It makes interpreting what you're seeing take that much more conscious effort because every shot is broken up into these little bursts of visibility. It puts the viewer into this primal state of trying to scan every burst of visible detail for sources of danger, because the alien so perfectly blends into this kind of environment. This trick is all the more effective in a video game in which, as far as you know, the alien really could be hiding behind any corner. Alien Isolation captures the aesthetic of the original film perfectly, and on some level this is appealing in terms of pure nostalgia. If you love the original movie as much as I do, it's just incredible to see such a meticulous recreation of its environments. You get a real sense while you play it that the game was made by a group of people who really loved the source material. It's full of these awesome little nods to the original movie.
Follow me.
Just keep the noise down, okay?
Oh, he just did the thing. He did the alien thing.
But I would be doing the game a huge disservice by stopping it saying that it effectively recreates the aesthetic of the original film. In a lot of ways, it builds on this aesthetic and takes it to new heights. You see, the Xenomorph wasn't the only source of anxiety in the original movie. A second and more omnipresent antagonist in that movie was the Weyland-Yutani Corporation itself. When you look at the environments of the Nostromo that were intended for crew habitation, you get this really eerie sense that there was a cold and robotic design behind them. The more obviously mechanical elements of the service corridors have had this really thin veneer of warm lighting and soft wall textures plastered over them, with the goal of lulling the crew into a state of docile obedience. There's just absolutely no human warmth to these environments. They feel like they were designed with the same cold utilitarianism that informed the building of every other part of the ship. Part of the air of mystery that makes the original Alien film so unsettling is just trying to make sense of what goals the corporation is actually pursuing. They're clearly using the crew as pawns and achieving some objective, but you don't really know what that objective is. Alien Isolation taps into this source of anxiety, but in my mind it does it more effectively. For one, the mystery of trying to figure out what the corporation is actually up to is more compelling in the game because the mystery unwinds more naturally as the player themselves discovers pieces of evidence hidden in communication logs that are scattered around the world. You also see these fantastic cases where the intended ambiance of the crew habitation areas is shattered by some physical hazard that's emerged as the ship has taken on structural damage. And this just highlights how fragile that illusion of warmth and comfort always was. Alien Isolation also more effectively taps into our fear of the vast emptiness of outer space than its film inspiration. The presence of the gas giant planet looming in the background through much of the game gives you a constant point of reference for how much larger than you the forces working against you are. It's a hallmark of the greatest visual works of horror that they can even make sources of light fill the viewer with dread. Darkness taps into the natural human fear of the unknown, and using it to make the viewer anxious is sort of a no-brainer. But in Alien Isolation, these sequences where a window opens you up to bright sunlight has this extremely unnerving effect. For one, it makes you feel exposed, but on a more visceral level, it taps into this feeling that a tiny layer of glass is all that separates you from the cold vacuum of space. And on the topic of lighting more generally, the game is a real visual powerhouse. Just like the movie that inspired it, Alien Isolation uses a lot of sporadic, strobing sources of light that break visual scenes up into these little snippets of processable information. And not only do these look absolutely fantastic, but just like in the movie, they succeed in making you feel like danger could be lurking in any corner. On every technical level, the game is just fantastic. It sounds phenomenal, from the guttural mechanical noises of the ship service corridors to the horrifying shrieking animal sounds that the xenomorph makes. I think that the decision to add loud thumping to its footsteps was an excellent one. It really gives it a commanding presence, and from a gameplay standpoint, it also gives you a way of tracking its location. It also draws a really dramatic contrast with times that the alien moves slowly and deliberately, and you don't hear any footsteps at all. It communicates really clearly that in these moments, the alien is stalking you, and it's trying to avoid making any noise so that it can maintain its element of surprise. Across the board, its animations are phenomenal. It looks the part both during slow, deliberate motion and during all-out pursuit. It has all these great little mannerisms. As an example, it'll stop and sniff the air while it's out searching for you. And its kill animations are really varied and, without exception, totally terrifying. A sequence of gameplay that really demonstrates the game's mastery of visual terror is one in which you're attempting to jettison the alien into space by luring it onto a detachable wing of the Sevastopol station and then ejecting it. This sequence is full of environmental features that subconsciously suggest the presence of the alien. It's also filled with strobing sources of light and smoke effects that make it really hard to make sense of the shapes that you're seeing. It has a windowed area that opens you up to direct sunlight, which makes you feel vulnerable both to the alien and to the vacuum of space. When the area detaches from the main station and begins to spin freely, the strobe effects intensify, and the spinning of the celestial bodies outside of the window add further visual complication to the environment, while also increasing your fear of the emptiness of space. This short sequence of gameplay condensed everything that was great about the aesthetics of the game into one unbelievably stressful and intense sequence. And I have a feeling that this is where I'm going to alienate some people. I swear to God that that pun was unintentional, but I really wish that this is where the game had ended, because from this point forward, to me, the game really overstayed its welcome. Part of the reason that I felt this way was that at that point, I felt that I'd already explored all of the gameplay systems to their fullest extent. During the 8 or so hours of playtime that followed this sequence, nothing really surprised me. It felt like the game just kept retreading the same gameplay beats that it had relied on for the first half. And the problem is that there just isn't that much depth or complexity to that experience. It's not that I thought that the gameplay of Alien Isolation was bad, it's just that I didn't find it engaging or interesting enough to make the 17 hours that I spent with it feel warranted. At its core, the gameplay involves completing a series of mini-games to open doors, hack computers, or turn systems of the ship on or off to help you get to your next story objective. In between these objectives are lots of hazards, and one hazard in particular that will push you to have to be creative with how you navigate the world. You can avoid these dangers by being sneaky and either timing your movements to slip past enemies unnoticed, or by finding paths that conceal your movement. Your other option is to craft and use tools. For instance, you can draw the attention of an enemy to one area so that you have more freedom of movement in another. There's also a small element to the game of environmental manipulation. For instance, you can hack these access panels that you find throughout the game to do things like disable security cameras or turn off the climate control in an area, which will add a kind of haziness to the air that you can use to conceal your movement. But there isn't a whole lot in the way of decision making here. There's not really a trade-off to balance. If you pass one of these access panels, it's usually a no-brainer to just flip whatever switches are going to open the door you need opened or will make you harder to see. So at its core, the game is about sneaking past enemies and finding crafting materials along the way to make tools that can assist you in getting from A to B. And the problem is that I didn't find a whole lot of depth or complexity in either experience. Let's talk for a minute about the resource conservation element to the game. This is an absolute mainstay of the horror genre of games. There were only a couple of consumable tools that I naturally found a use case for in my last playthrough because it was generally very easy to outright avoid enemies. It was pretty rare that I thought that using a flare or a noisemaker to distract an enemy naturally made sense. And if I'm honest, half the reason that I probably ever used these tools was that early on I ended up just gathering so many of the crafting components to make them that I couldn't carry more of them, so I figured that I may as well use some of these tools to free up space. Likewise, ammo conservation was a fairly straightforward decision-making process. Basically, if the alien was present in an area, I would never use my guns under any circumstances for pretty obvious reasons. But in any case where for story reasons it was obvious that the alien wasn't going to be around, ammo management became a really simple case of smoke 'em if you got 'em. That isn't to say that I shot every enemy that I encountered. In fact, one of my go-to moves for the Working Joe androids was to just run past them. However, any time that an enemy served as a real barrier to performing some hacking minigame that I needed to perform, it was generally a no-brainer to just shoot them as long as the alien wasn't around. Over the entire course of my last playthrough, I never once felt like I needed to make some serious or tense decision about how to best use my resources. For the most part, I just crafted and used tools whenever I needed to free up inventory space, and I shot enemies anytime that I thought that trying to sneak past them was going to be overly time-consuming. I never felt any serious tension in deciding whether to use any of the resources that I'd gathered. For instance, I never thought, man, I want to shoot this enemy, but I'm just afraid that the alien will hear. Because as I said before, anytime that the alien was present, it made the drawbacks of using a gun too severe to even be worth considering. I always found that the decision of whether to use any tool sort of made itself. For instance, once you find the flamethrower, there's not a whole lot of decision making to be had. The only times that you might be tempted to use it are cases where the only alternative is certain death. I think if the game had given you way less flamethrower fuel, it could have put you in this interesting position of needing to be clever with your use of Molotov cocktails and possibly with using your firearms instead of the flamethrower in order to dispatch facehuggers. But with the amount of fuel that the game provided me with, I just used the flamethrower anytime that it occurred to me to use it, and I never once faced the fear of running out of fuel. After all, it's only in situations where you've been detected by the alien that you need to use it, and if you're playing the game the way that you should be playing it, the goal anyways is to never have this happen. That leads to the real meat and potatoes of the gameplay experience, which is trying to sneak past enemies, particularly the alien. The basic problem that I had here is that without any of the feedback systems that stealth games typically incorporate that tell you, for instance, when you're visible and when you're hidden, the sneaking in this game ended up feeling like taking educated gambles. Basically, what most of the sneaking in this game entails is waiting until you think that the alien is moving away from you, and then trying to slip to the area that you need to get to while hoping that the alien doesn't suddenly turn around and head back towards you. If you realize that it has, you go back to hiding and wait some more until hopefully next time it actually does leave. Or it just kills you and then you reload a checkpoint and try again, but in any event the result is the same. You try again and you hope that you have better luck with its search pattern next time. You can use gadgets to distract the alien, and in some rare but awesome cases, you can exploit environmental hazards to make it retreat temporarily, but my bread and butter approach, and I bet this is true for most people, was to just wait until I couldn't hear its footsteps and then pray to RNGesus that I could make it to where I needed to go before it returned. You have some extra options for evading the alien, such as floor vents that let you pass through areas unseen, or lockers that can get you out of trouble if the alien enters a room that you're hiding in. And while these don't do a whole lot for gameplay depth per se, what they really do enhance is the immersive synergy of the game, and this is a part of the reason that Alien Isolation is going to score fairly well in this category. What makes these elements interesting is the fact that over time, the alien learns about your playstyle and adapts to it. For instance, if you regularly use lockers to hide from the alien, it will stop and reflect on the fact that it's always finding empty rooms after thinking that it had you cornered, and it will eventually have a eureka moment where it will start to check the lockers. The same goes if you hop in every vent that you find. Eventually it starts to check them. What this does is it makes you have to think about the alien as though it were a stalking predator. You start playing this game of trying to scramble your behaviors so that it can't learn how you operate. A number of the game's systems really do wonders for making you think about the alien as though it were an actual flesh and blood creature, and chief among those are the ways that it responds to sound. For instance, your motion tracking device produces sound as you use it, so the comfort that you get from using it constantly has to balance against the fear that if you use it while the alien is too close, it might hear you. Each movement speed that you have, sneaking, walking, and all-out sprinting, make different levels of noise, and it's extremely tense and immersive to have to balance the benefits of getting somewhere quickly against the drawbacks of making noise. If you use a save point in the game while the alien is nearby, you might find that you're immediately forced to find a hiding spot because it will come to investigate the noise that you just made in using the save point. As much work as the surface elements of the game did to immerse me in the experience, the fact that many of the gameplay components sucked me in even further made this, by far, one of the most immersive games that I've ever played, with the following caveat. It was one of the most immersive games that I've ever played while the illusion remained intact for me. It just so happens that the only thing that we have left to talk about for this game is when the illusion stopped working. And unfortunately, for me, this was almost the entire second half of the game. I mentioned a little while ago that I wish that Alien Isolation had ended roughly around the time that you jettison the alien into outer space in Mission 10, and that the game really overstayed its welcome for me after that point. When I finished that sequence, I have to be honest, I had already started to see cracks in the illusion of the game. I prefaced this review by talking a bit about the challenge of terror fatigue and the unique problem that horror games face in preserving the illusion of the monster as an actual creature and not as a video game AI. After all, in a horror game, the player is potentially going to spend hours in close contact with the monster, not the 5 minutes that they would in a horror movie. Here's the basic rundown of how terror fatigue started to set in for me in my last playthrough. When you first encounter the alien in the game, the terror that grips you is so strong that you can barely muster the courage to step out of the first hiding space that you find. You sit hiding under some table thinking, I haven't heard its footsteps in a little while, maybe I should go now, before you hear its footsteps return and you dart right back to your little hidey hole. But it occurs to you after a little while of playing this game that at some point you're just going to have to take the chance. You're going to have to tolerate some risk of it finding you in order to progress the story at all. So you start to creep forward towards the objective, stopping at every hiding spot that you can to wait and listen until eventually you open a door and you find the alien standing right on the other side of it and it kills you. So you load your save point and try again. This time you play it slowly and cautiously, just like before. And during a moment where you think that the alien is walking away from you, you seize the opportunity to dart to your next objective, but right after you step out of cover, the alien changes its mind and turns around, which again results in a death. On the one hand, this sort of randomness in its behavior makes it seem more realistic. The fact that you can't predict what it's going to do next makes it all the more compelling as a horror monster. But here's the other thing that this does. You start to realize that as careful as you can be, there is always going to be some chance that you hit a bad patch of luck. For instance, you might be silently slinking along and just happen to walk under a ceiling vent where the alien was sitting, leading to an instant death. This means that as the player, you have to constantly psychologically prepare yourself to be detected and killed by the alien at any moment. And this is where terror fatigue really begins to set in. You spend hours and hours traveling around the world thinking, no matter what I do, there's going to be some chance that when I turn the next corner, it's going to be there and it'll kill me. And in a lot of these cases, you end up being right. and every subsequent death like this that occurs, your fear of it happening decreases a little bit more. But here's the bigger problem that this apparent randomness in its behavior caused for me. Because of the fact that there was always some small chance that I would run into bad luck with its pathing and die, I grew to see these runs where I spent a lot of time tippy-toeing around and progressing very slowly to be a waste of time. Every time that I slowly crept through an area and spent 10 minutes trying to loot every container and read every terminal and then ended up dying because I misjudged what the alien was going to do next, it occurred to me that I had just wasted 10 minutes. I also started to realize, like I said before, that I wasn't really using a lot of the gadgets and gizmos that I was crafting, unless it was to free up space because I had so many of them. It was then that I had a big brain moment. If I don't really need the crafting materials anyways, and if my odds of being screwed over by the randomness in the alien's behavior increase as a function of the amount of time that I spend exploring an area, then why not just minimize the amount of time that I spend exploring? I mean, why not just wait until what seems like my first decent opening, and then just walk straight to my next objective without pausing? Sure, there's a chance that I'll be killed by the alien in the middle of this attempt, but this is always going to be true no matter how careful I am. And if I die in one of these quick attempts, at least I won't waste a lot of time. And once I made this mental switch in priorities from avoid the alien to avoid wasting time, it accelerated my terror fatigue to unprecedented levels. Once I had stopped trying to hide every time I heard its footsteps, I started to realize things about it that I never would have otherwise realized. For instance, I realized that its vision had some really obvious video game logic to it, and that even if I could clearly see the alien over the top of some object, for the alien this counted as some kind of barrier that prevented it from seeing me. This routinely led me to these situations of playing Ring Around the Rosie with the alien as an alternative to finding a hiding spot, and every time I did this, I was that much less afraid of it going forward. So this is where I was with the game before the sequence where you jettison the alien into outer space. The cracks were starting to set into the illusion, but the illusion was nowhere near broken. In fact, if I needed to hack some computer in an area that the alien was present in, I would still cower underneath the table and wait till I couldn't hear it any longer. It wasn't until the second half of the game that the illusion snapped entirely. You see, what followed this gameplay sequence was another 7 or so hours of gameplay with no new additions or formula changes, save for the fact that for the next 3 hours, the alien wasn't present at all. Now that I hear myself saying this out loud, I almost don't believe it. I half expect that I just hallucinated the entire thing. But in the event that it was real, the developer's big idea for how to follow this intense, heart-pounding sequence of gameplay was to make you play 3 more hours of hacking and door-opening minigames with the twist of lacking the one element that had made those sequences compelling. The core appeal of the gameplay of Alien Isolation was fundamentally tied to overcoming fear paralysis, to mustering up the courage to expose yourself for long enough to complete these minigames. The gameplay loop required the presence of a terrifying enemy. Without this element of pure debilitating terror to overcome, it starts to get really difficult to not notice that all you're doing is waiting, walking, and playing little minigames. And that's exactly what you get for the next 3 hours. The exact same sort of underwhelming gameplay without the psychological blinders of a terrifying, unstoppable enemy to keep you from realizing just how underwhelming it is.
Yeah, we gotta get out of here.
Is my exit open, Ricardo?
Instead of overcoming terror, you're overcoming enemies who are mildly annoying, who do just enough harm to you to pull you out of your hacking minigame. This stretch of gameplay felt like such a waste of time to me that my entire play strategy shifted to getting through it as quickly as possible. Previously, I had been a little bit annoyed with the game's habit of making you search around a big environment to find one specific thing that it wanted you to interact with, but I didn't mind it too much because the consistent threat of the alien meant that I was never really bored. This changed in the second half of the game though. I started to just look up walkthroughs every time I didn't know where the game wanted me to go because the thought of spending any more time walking around just bored me to tears. Sequences where I had to hack 3 or 4 different computers to complete an objective had previously felt thrilling because they involved overcoming fear, but now these same sequences seem like they were there purely to eat up time. Seemingly in recognition of how boring you must find this alien-free stretch of the game, the developers make you surrender all of your weapons for one mission. It's like they're saying, look, we know that you find these robot enemies boring, so we're going to take your weapons away so that you have to take them seriously. And in spectacularly video gamey fashion, you conveniently find all of the weapon types that you surrendered in this sequence sitting on the ground right after you finish it. And while the alien does eventually make a triumphant return, aliens in fact, the problem was that the illusion of the world had completely snapped for me at this point. The mental shift to how do I minimize the amount of time that this game wastes was one that I could never unmake. These long atmosphere building sequences where you put on a spacesuit and slowly walk around had annoyed me a little bit in the first half of the game.
Just put a tea kettle on and I'll be with you shortly. Maybe catch up on your Chaucer.
But at this point in the game, they felt like they were there for no other reason than to increase the runtime. I was also just completely over the idea of hiding from enemies, including the alien. And I decided that the flamethrower was going to be the main pillar of my playstyle going forward. Sequences that the game had intended to be thrilling and climactic just fell flat for me because by this point, my only interest was in seeing the credits roll.
Here's the problem. Like, the game so badly wants this to be tense and scary right now. The problem is that it's wasted so much of my time that I'm just like, I turn around, dude, go away. Go away. I don't want you here.
I think the point of no return for me in terms of immersion was when I started to find a weird sort of amusement in the game's absolute refusal to just let it end, and its insistence to make you hack just one more computer, open one more door, twist some more of these piston things. Yes, you have to do all 4 of them individually. By the end of its runtime, the absolute worst case scenario for a horror game had completely materialized. The monster had stopped being a monster, and the scariest thing about it was the amount of my time that it had the potential to waste. However, because of the fact that the illusion of the game was extremely powerful for the first half of my playthrough, and the fact that I had no real technical issues with the game to speak of, I still have to say that it was an above average experience in terms of seamlessness, if only slightly above average. There's this really infamous review of Alien Isolation that IGN put out. They gave the game a score of 5.9 out of 10, putting it in the mediocre range of their scale. Here's my hot take. Every single criticism that they brought up in that review is 100% valid. However, I completely agree with the general consensus that it was an absurd review. The problem is in how these issues were weighted in comparison to the things that Alien Isolation does phenomenally well. On my scale, Alien Isolation falls into the great range, with its score of 28 out of 40. The things that harmed the experience didn't come anywhere close to stopping me from enthusiastically recommending it. Also, because of the fact that it got a perfect score in one category, the game also earns automatic must-play status. If I wanted to succinctly describe what keeps the game out of the legendary range of my scale, it's the fact that its immersive quality is so fundamentally tied to the psychological power that its antagonist holds. And unfortunately, by not knowing when to wrap things up and call it quits, the game not only dilutes the terror factor by a huge margin, it also really draws sharp attention to how basic and underwhelming its core gameplay is once the fear factor dies down. The thing is though, what it does well in a bar-setting way. It's an absolute masterpiece of terror, and I think it's going to be a long time before a game makes me feel as terrified to inch forward as I regularly did in the first half of my Alien Isolation playthrough. Amnesia The Bunker takes obvious inspiration from Alien Isolation. In fact, it's hard to imagine it having been made at all without Alien Isolation having caused a massive resurgence in the popularity of the idea of a horror game in which one all-powerful enemy stalks you over the course of the game. In the category of strength of illusion, I don't think that Amnesia The Bunker holds the same level of masterpiece status that Alien Isolation does, but at the same time it's not that far behind. I would liken the difference between these two games in terms of presentation to the difference between a dish served at some Michelin-starred molecular gastronomy restaurant and a perfectly cooked ribeye steak. You can spend a lot more time talking about what makes the first meal special, and you can work in way more adjectives to your description of the meal. But for the second meal, it's hard to say a whole lot more than, damn, that was good. But I'll try my best to sing The Bunker the praise that it's due in this category. This category of my review system lumps together a lot of things like graphics, world design, lighting, and all of that, but it also includes writing quality. And Amnesia The Bunker has, without a doubt, my favorite premise of any horror game that I've ever played. A big thing that pulls me out of any horror experience is whenever you can clearly see the hand of a writer at play. A great example of this is whenever a character decides that they're going to go investigate that noise that they just heard, and then very predictably something goes wrong. My favorite horror movies start with the premise that all of the tension in the movie naturally follows from, and they're able to maintain a sense of dread without having to resort to plot contrivances to force the characters into dangerous situations. John Carpenter's The Thing is a great example of this. Why does the situation feel so bleak and hopeless? Because the characters are trapped in an Antarctic research base with a shape-shifting alien, and they don't know who among them are alien impersonations. Why don't they leave or call for help? Well, they can't reach any other bases by radio, probably because the Thing has already assimilated them, and their helicopter was sabotaged, either by the Thing trying to trap them in the base, or by a human who wanted to prevent the Thing from using it to escape the civilization. MacReady and the rest of the research team are stuck with an extremely powerful and intelligent enemy with no means of escape or backup, and all of the tension in the story stems naturally from this premise. The actions of the surviving humans, and MacReady in particular, are actually extremely rational and well thought out, and this is part of what makes the Thing so frightening. Even though our protagonists are doing everything they can to survive, and their actions are well thought through, this situation by its nature is so bleak and hopeless that it may be more than they can manage. Amnesia The Bunker has a premise like this. You are a French soldier in the First World War. One day while out and about, you sustain injuries that land you in a coma, and you end up back in the infirmary of your bunker. Now, the other members of your bunker are still going about their business, and one of the things that they're up to is trying to tunnel underneath the German lines. That makes sense. Trench warfare is slow, brutal, and consumes a huge amount of human life for every bit of territory captured, so tunneling underneath the enemy line is actually a pretty smart plan. Well, the thing is, while tunneling, your compatriots discovered some ancient underground Roman ruins, and well, there was something in these ruins. Something that causes transformations in certain beings. For instance, it turns rats into these giant, corpse-devouring monstrosities. But of greater relevance to your predicament, it turned one member of your team into some kind of creature, one that you might describe as disagreeable. This creature started tunneling behind all the walls of the bunker and coming out at night to snack on your fellow soldiers. Realizing that this was not a situation conducive to health or well-being, a huge portion of your comrades decided to grab whatever weapons or supplies they could, bail out of the bunker, and cave in the entrance with dynamite so that the creature would be trapped inside. Sometime after this happens, you awaken from your coma in the infirmary with no idea of what's happened. Now, why is this situation so bleak and hopeless? Well, you're trapped in a bunker with a terrifying creature that's built a network of tunnels behind the walls. Why are you alone? Your fellow soldiers didn't want to carry dead weight with them, so they left your ass in the infirmary. Why are you trapped? The other soldiers sealed the entrance of the bunker to trap the creature. Why are there so few supplies left in the bunker for you to use to your advantage? The other soldiers took as many weapons and supplies with them as they could. After all, they were fleeing into an active war zone. And lastly, what do you need to do? Escape. That's it. Your entire mission is to get the dynamite and the ignition handle that you need to reopen the cave-in that the fleeing soldiers caused. The bunker starts out on this extremely strong premise. This situation is terrifying and stressful by its nature, but it also gives you an unbelievably clear sense of purpose. The only way to escape this hell is to find the supplies that you need. The visual presentation of the game is one of straight realism, where Alien Isolation sets you in this stunningly intricate space station whose visual design was fundamentally developed to work with the design of its antagonist. The bunker's presentation is much more restrained. You're in a bunker, something that was built with a very simple and practical military purpose, and accordingly you're not going to run into any significant amount of visual variety, save for the Roman ruins that you're gonna run into a little later in the game. The bunker is basically a big hole in the ground, and that's exactly what it looks like. Everything has this phenomenal degree of texture to it. Surfaces look grungy and dirty, which makes sense because this isn't exactly the Ritz-Carlton. Paper documents that you find scattered around the world are all brown and oxidized, like they would be if they were stored for a long period of time in a humid, dark, poorly ventilated bunker. Everything seems to be very practically built. The tunnels made through stone, for instance, are just wide enough to facilitate the movement of people and equipment. There are these hanging clouds of dust everywhere in the bunker, which just make everything feel that much more stuffy and claustrophobic. This game makes you feel like you're underground, and that's exactly what it's trying to do. Evidence of the creature's presence can be found all over the bunker: broken pieces of furniture, splotches of blood, and corpses surrounded by ravenous rats. The lighting in the game, while simplistic, is very effective. There's a huge contrast between dark, unlit corners and areas under direct illumination of a light bulb, and the relative sparseness of the lighting setup in the bunker means that you'll be enveloped by darkness for a majority of your time with the game. The sound quality of the game is absolutely fantastic. Long stretches of ominous silence will periodically be interrupted by the boom of artillery, which makes you feel like the ceiling might cave in. Your footsteps have this really ominous echo to them as you make your way through tunnels, which makes traveling around at any significant speed feel very stressful. The rumbling, scrapey sounds that the creature makes as it travels around behind the walls are unbelievably unsettling, but the other thing that's great about them is how easy they are to spatially locate. For instance, you can really tell when its motion is taking it towards a specific opening in the wall. The monster's vocalizations are also just thunderous and otherworldly. It's almost nauseating being close to it while it's openly searching the bunker. The presentation of the monster in general is much the same as the presentation of the bunker overall. It lacks the sophistication and a panache that the presentation of the xenomorph in Alien Isolation has, both in design and in execution, but it's still unbelievably effective. Its animations, sounds, and especially its behaviors are more than enough to convince you for your entire playthrough that somewhere behind the walls of the bunker, something is lurking that's part human and part crazed, bloodthirsty beast. While I wouldn't call Amnesia the Bunker an aesthetic masterpiece, it did completely succeed in convincing me for my entire playthrough that I was trapped in a dark, dirty bunker with the only thing worse than a monster: a French monster. The reason that Amnesia the Bunker is without a doubt my favorite horror game of all time is fundamentally tied to its gameplay. Before we look at how the gameplay enhances your immersion, leading to the grippingness that I talked about at the start of the video, it's worth mentioning that the gameplay systems you have to play with are, in and of themselves, fairly deep and engaging. The Bunker is a full-blown immersive sim. If you've ever played a game like Deus Ex or System Shock, you'll feel right at home here. In your quest to find the two pieces of equipment that you need to escape the bunker, you're going to encounter obstacles and setbacks, and you work around these setbacks with a combination of exploration, resource conservation, and clever exploitation of the game's systems. And man, does this game have a lot of systems. If a pack of ravenous rats are blocking your path, for instance, the sky's the limit for how you can go about clearing them away. You can distract them with a more tempting morsel of food, scare them away with fire, or make them disperse with a gas grenade. Any of these options require that you use a consumable resource, and if you want to permanently be rid of that particular group of rats, you need to also burn their food source, which requires that you spend even more finite resources. If you don't want to expend the time and resources to do that, you can just shoot them if your ammo supply permits, or you can look for creative ways to use the environment to your advantage to get rid of them. But both of these two options will make noise, which causes an altogether different type of problem. You see, the creature that stalks you over the course of the game hunts by sound, and it'll be triggered to your general whereabouts if you make either lots of small noises in a short amount of time, or one big noise like an explosion or a gunshot. Its hearing ability is especially good when it's behind the walls of the bunker in its tunnel system, and you have to be very intentional about the noise that you make when you know that it's in its tunnels. Before fleeing the bunker, the other soldiers took to leaving booby traps all over the place to alert them of the creature's presence, and setting off just one of these traps is a virtual guarantee that you're about to have company. You have a good degree of control over whether the creature stays behind the walls and hunts by sound, or whether it comes out and openly hunts you, in which case it becomes more of an immediate threat while being less capable of tracking you. The flagship feature of the game is the generator system. You can power the light bulbs that are strung up all throughout the bunker by activating the main generator, but this isn't a simple on-off switch. To use the generator, you have to fill it with gasoline, which there's a finite supply of in the bunker. On normal difficulty, you'll get just under 2 minutes of light for a single gas canister. And what turning the lights on achieves is that the creature's behavior becomes much more predictable. When the overhead lights are on, it's dissuaded from exiting its cave system. Now make no mistake, it absolutely can and will come out when the lights are on. It just won't do so unless it thinks that the odds of catching you are high. For the most part, what it deems worth venturing out into the light for are cases where you've made a very loud noise or cases where you've made a lot of little noises in the same area in a short amount of time. In either case, it'll emerge from the exit hole that's closest to the originating sound. The game will continually put you in some sort of predicament like the following. You need to get into a locked room, and there's a fairly obvious way to do it. For instance, you could destroy the door by a number of methods, or you could shoot a padlock off of a door. The problem is that with near certainty, this will trigger the presence of the creature. Your other option is to search around the bunker to see if you can find a more clever way to gain access to that room, either by finding an alternate entrance or by finding a tool that will let you silently gain access. But pursuing either of these options is going to take time, which is going to run down your fuel supply. You can free yourself of this time constraint by exploring the bunker with the lights off, but doing this means that the creature can go anywhere in the bunker that it wants to, whenever it wants to, and your odds of encountering it are going to dramatically increase. No matter how you slice it, the gameplay of the bunker comes down to making tough decisions under the pressure of either the time left in your fuel or the presence of the creature. At all times, you're gonna have to deal with at least one of these pressures, and it makes the game an unbelievably tense and stimulating experience. Adding to this pressure is the constraint of limited inventory space, especially in the early phases before you find resources that expand your carrying capacity. It makes you have to really think through what you think you're going to need for the next stretch of gameplay. And the stretches of gameplay in the bunker are basically broken up into runs. The generator is housed inside of an area that functions as your safe zone, where you have a save station, an item chest, and a world map as well. You'll spend a lot of time in this room looking at the map, planning where you want to go next, deciding what gear you want to take with you, and whether you want to make the run with the generator on or off. Inventory management is handled very well in the game. Items all have very clear and distinct roles. They have extremely useful but specific applications, so you always have to balance giving yourself lots of options by bringing a lot of gadgets with you versus leaving yourself free inventory space to gather more resources that you find out on your run. If you always fill your inventory to the brim with tools, you're never, for instance, going to be able to bring more generator fuel back to your base with you. What's great about this part of the game is that there's never an obviously correct answer to how you should proceed, and it gives you a strong incentive to experiment with the sandbox to find multiple uses for each type of tool. If a certain tool only has one potential use that you found, but another one can be used in 2 or 3 different ways, then your decision of which tool to make will get a little bit easier, but this is only going to be true if you've done some experimentation. The gameplay systems in the bunker are in and of themselves good. The game is by no means the most mechanically deep immersive sim that you'll ever play, but the systems are deep enough that through the entire course of the game, you'll consistently find new ways to make those systems work for you instead of against you. Here's one of my favorite aha moments that I had playing the game. The bunker creature gets into these fits of indignant rage whenever a loud noise breaks the silence of its lair. And while on the one hand these episodes are very frightening, after you experience enough of them, it might occur to you that you might be able to use these to your advantage. Say that you're trying to get through a chunk of gameplay where there are a lot of destructible physical barriers in your way. You could spend a lot of time and a lot of generator fuel destroying these one by one, and each time having to hide from the creature as it comes to investigate the noise that you've made. Or you could chuck some noise-making device right into the middle of that area and cross your fingers hoping that the creature in its fit of rage will destroy some of the obstacles as it storms around trying to find the source of the noise. But the real magic of the bunker has to do with what these gameplay systems do to your sense of immersion. In the category of immersive synergy, I'm scoring the game based on how the gameplay systems themselves enhance my immersion in the world above and beyond what the aesthetic elements of the world achieved. If you've watched any of my earlier reviews, you might recall that The Bunker has been my go-to example of what a 10 out of 10 game looks like in this category. So yeah, spoiler alert here. But if I were to try to list the top 5 stretches of gameplay in my entire history of playing games in which I was the most immersed in the experience, 3 of those experiences would probably be runs that I made in Amnesia The Bunker. Let's look at a classic bread and butter gameplay situation that you'll find yourself in over and over again. You're making a run with the generator on, and you need to move some object, and doing this is going to produce some amount of noise. Moving it more quickly will obviously produce more noise, but moving it more slowly to minimize that noise is going to burn more generator fuel. The anxiety that this stirs inside of you is so unbelievably potent that it just dissolves the barrier between you and the screen. It doesn't feel video gamey or gimmicky in the slightest. It's a tension that feels baked into the premise of the situation that you find yourself in. And in managing this tension, you're thinking about the situation like you would have to if you were actually there. When I open drawers and unlock doors in the game, I always do it as slowly as I can manage to because I'm so afraid of making noise. And here's the thing, if given the option, I would always prefer that a horror game had higher production values. If the creature in the game had higher quality animations, if it had scarier sounding roars, if it would realistically end up covered in blood after devouring a corpse, all of these things would enhance my immersion in the game. But all of these additions to the game combined wouldn't enhance my immersion in the game 1/10 as much as this does right here. As I move my mouse as slowly as I can to open or close a door, this outlet for expressing my internal fear through an intuitive physical action that the game actually recognizes and responds to just completely sucks me through the screen. And while little details like this are extremely immersive, in the scheme of everything that the Bunker's gameplay does to immerse you, this is small fries. I mean, this is pure window dressing. The game is just full of systems that let you interact with the world in a way that makes it more believable. Just think about the fact that the game lets you manage the overhead lights. You have a lever that you can press that directly alters the behavior of the creature. A developer with less mastery of horror might have thought that this would make the monster less scary, since it gives you a method of empowerment. Nothing could be further from the truth. In deciding to turn the overhead lights on, your mindset is one of a child insisting that mommy leave the nightlight on so that the closet monster will stay shut inside. It also makes the sequences where the lights do go out that much more intense, because you're in a situation that you caused. You miscalculated the time that you would spend on this run, and now the situation that you find yourself in is one of your own making. In Alien Isolation, my fear of the xenomorph really decayed over time because I realized that there was just nothing I could do to totally guarantee that it wouldn't appear at any moment. So I just had to clench my butt cheeks and be constantly internally prepared for it to pop out of a vent and kill me. In the bunker though, I only encountered the creature in situations where my choices naturally led to the encounter. This not only meant that I encountered it less often, which decreased the effects of terror fatigue, but it also meant that when I did encounter it, it felt so real. Every time that I had a face-to-face encounter with the creature, you could trace the breadcrumbs back to pinpoint what I had done to be in this situation. This just makes the creature feel like an actual flesh and blood entity, like it's actually lurking behind the walls, that there isn't some random number generator running that can always make it appear, that you are the one that triggers it to appear through a lack of caution and planning. Just like an actual stalking predator, the bunker creature's behavior seems logically based around you and your actions. You can very easily imagine it weighing how much it wants to eat you against how uncomfortable it would be to step out into the light. I just want to show a short sequence of gameplay that shows what's so completely intoxicating about this game. I had fueled my generator for what I imagined would be a short trip. You're incentivized in the game to always fill the generator close to the level that you think your run is going to require, because if you refill the generator when it's close to but not quite empty, you get some bonus fuel, hence you have a reason to not just always fill it to the brim. I knew for this run that I was going to come to a junction in which I needed to either destroy a door or make a group of rats disperse. And since I had a gas grenade, I decided to make the rats disperse since that would avoid making noise. When I arrived at my destination, however, I found that what I needed to access was behind a padlocked door. The only tool that I had to open that padlock with was a grenade, which I would have to use in conjunction with an explosive barrel. But if I used that grenade to open the padlock, I wouldn't also be able to use it to open the door that I had found locked, which meant that I would have to go right back through the pack of mutant rats that I had come through. This means that I would need to find a place to stop and use a bandage in the middle of my escape because the rats would inevitably bite me as I passed through. My other options were to just completely put off pursuing this objective until later in the game when I had found the bolt cutters that could silently open this lock, or to just come back with better equipment so that I could either permanently get rid of the pack of rats or destroy the door ahead of time to make my escape easier. But the problem is that all of these options would have consumed more fuel and more finite resources, and I was already there. I was standing next to the padlock with a grenade that could open it. As I sat there weighing these options, the clock just ticked away, my precious fuel supply dwindling by the moment. I decided that I'd rather be a little sloppy here than to burn through the additional resources that I'd need to in order to do this more cleanly. I opted to blow the padlock, but under the time pressure of my generator running low on fuel and the paralyzing fear of knowing that the creature was about to make an appearance, I ran not through the exit door, but into a closet. And by the time I realized this, all that there was time left to do was close the door and say a prayer, maybe try to block the door with a bucket. Yeah, I think that ought to do it. The fact that I had put myself in this situation through my own impulsivity and lack of foresight made every sound that the creature made in the next room, and the flickering of the overhead lights that always accompany its presence, feel 10 times as terrifying as anything that had happened to me in my Alien Isolation playthrough. And as bad as I just wanted to stay in that closet until the creature had calmed down and was no longer on high alert, I realized that I had precious little time remaining to get back to my base before the lights went out. So I chucked a brick at the rats to make at least a couple of them disperse, and then took my unavoidable damage. I put a good amount of distance between me and the rats before looking for a spot to stop and bandage up, and then I fought internally with every fiber of discipline and rationality in my body to not listen to the instincts that were screaming at me to sprint back to base as quickly as possible, because I knew that the creature was on high alert for sound in the area. Walking in the game is very stressful, because it's not as silent as crouch walking and it's not as fast as sprinting, but this situation called for a happy medium between stealth and speed. When I made it back to my base to find that I had made it with something like 15 seconds to spare on my generator time, I can't even begin to describe the feeling of relief.
Ho ho ho! Look at that. Fuck, this game is so great. Holy shit, like if you had a graph of my cortisol levels.
The predictable logic that the creature in the bunker follows mirrors what I love so much about John Carpenter's The Thing. The fact that it follows predictable rules not only makes it seem more real in and of itself, but it also allows you to get into this mental game of trying to predict and anticipate its moves. This isn't just engaging in its own right, it also sucks you even further into thinking about the creature as though it were an actual entity. You start thinking, if I'm going to make a noise here, it's going to come out of that hole. So if I block that hole, I can delay its arrival long enough to safely get out of dodge. As you start to gain confidence in using these sorts of tricks, you might start to feel as though you have a handle on things, and as a consequence, you might start getting comfortable.
Get wrecked, loser. I take it back. I take it back.
You might start to think that you can start spending more time exploring on every run and then just sprint back to base, because you've basically learned how to predict when the creature is going to spawn and when it isn't. What you might not be considering though is that even though it isn't attacking you during these stretches where you sprint back to your base, it sure as hell is noticing that you're sprinting. In fact, it'll start to piece together that every time it hears you sprint, no matter where the footsteps originate, they always end in the same basic place. So it eventually figures out that when it hears you start to sprint, it ought to head not to where the sound is, but to where the sound indicates that you're going to be.
Clever guy. He thinks I'm heading back. So he's gonna sit and wait.
When I realized that the creature had outsmarted me here, that my complacency had come very close to making me a meal, in that moment, it was a genuine flesh and blood monster in my mind. It snapped me right back to the reality of my situation, and it reminded me that if I didn't treat this thing with the respect that it deserved, it would be the end of me. And if this entire video has one takeaway message, let it be this. Some horror game developers want to make their monsters unpredictable so that the player never feels safe, and in some sense this does work. But there are two really important considerations to be weighed here. The first is that this will lead to terror fatigue over long stretches of time. No matter how phenomenally well designed your world and creature are, the terror factor will die down as the player learns to just brace themselves to be attacked by the creature at any moment. But here is the more important consideration. This moment that I had in Amnesia the Bunker of realizing that the monster had outplayed me was one of the most disturbing and unsettling experiences that I've ever had in a horror game. It really made me feel like I was being hunted. It was 10 times as memorable and impactful to me as any of the, quote, stakes-raising sequences of Alien Isolation. And this moment was only possible because the creature had followed such predictable rules up until that point. This was not a terrifying encounter, it was a gripping encounter. It was an encounter that sucked me through the screen and made me feel as though I was there, in the bunker, alone with an intelligent and ruthless predator. I'll round off my review of this masterpiece of a game by also praising it for being very nearly completely seamless. There were very few hiccups that occurred for me over the course of my last playthrough that snapped me out of the experience. In fact, the only real time that I saw the ones and zeros of the game were in cases where my proximity to an enemy clearly triggered some kind of video game logic. The creature, for instance, can instantly pivot 180 degrees if you get too close to it while it's in its searching mode. And this just gives you a little bit of a reminder that it isn't actually a creature. Something similar happened a few times for me with groups of rats. Rather than seeming like an actual group of animals, it often seemed like the game had defined a circle that if you walk inside of, you just start instantly taking damage. And it'll do its best to animate the rats inside of that circle in a way that tries to make the damage that you're receiving make sense, but there were some times for me that this illusion broke down a bit. That's legitimately all that I can think of. This is, by far, to me, the game that immersed me the most deeply in its gameplay experience of any video game that I have ever played, period. It scores a 35 out of 40, putting it in the #1 spot of my current score leaderboard, and just a hair short of the fabled unicorn range of my review scale. And I'll be real with you, it's going to be dethroned for the #1 spot, probably fairly soon in fact, but it's completely possible that this game will never drop out of the top 5, even if I run this channel to the day I die. The only thing that keeps this game out of that fabled unicorn territory to me is that it doesn't offer that much in terms of gameplay depth. Don't get me wrong, it's not a shallow experience by any stretch of the imagination. It just doesn't have the intricacy or the flexibility in its sandbox that would make me feel comfortable putting it in the highest level of my scoring system. In that one very important category, I'd say that it was good, but not great or legendary. At the current moment, it's absolutely one of my 5 favorite games ever made, and without a shadow of a doubt, it's my favorite horror game ever made. I cannot urge you strongly enough to give the game a shot if you haven't tried it already. If a magical genie were to offer me one video game related wish that would be granted with certainty, here's how I'd use it. I would want the recently announced sequel to Alien Isolation to take a good look at Amnesia The Bunker, apply some critical lessons, and reinvent itself as a full-blown horror immersive sim. Basically, I'd want the game to go full System Shock 3, and be done with this game design in which every story beat is an excuse to make you play more minigames to hack computers or unlock doors. The perfect sequel to Alien Isolation would be one in which the gameplay loop involved constantly making these tense decisions about how to navigate the world, conserve resources, and manage the presence of the alien. Amnesia The Bunker is just a perfect game to take inspiration from in this regard. Instead of the tension resulting from having to hack a computer and not knowing if the alien is going to appear during the minigame, the tension should come from having to decide how you want to get to that computer. Should you do it the noisy and resource-efficient way, or the silent way that'll consume more resources? I don't think that it's absolutely necessary for this hypothetical game to implement a system like the generator from the bunker, but I do think that it's necessary for the game to slow its roll with your exposure to the xenomorph, unless they want to think about dramatically cutting down the runtime of the game. In my entire most recent playthrough of Amnesia The Bunker, I probably caught 4 full unobstructed glimpses of the creature in the 9 hours that I spent with the game. And this is a big part of the reason that even by the end of that game, I was still completely sucked into the experience. On the one hand, the tools that I had for managing the presence of the monster were tense and interesting, but I think more importantly, the fact that I only saw it as a consequence of making a mistake made it feel so much more impactful when I did see it. I want to be clear, I'm not requesting that Alien Isolation 2 try to limit your time with the alien to be below any absolute threshold. I'm just saying that your relationship with the creature stops being interesting if it's just sort of always there. It loses its emotional power over time, and you really start to see through the illusion, no matter how expensive that illusion was to produce. The developers of Alien Isolation 2 could bankrupt the company trying to make the xenomorph look and sound as scary as possible. I mean, they could add ray-traced reflections to its carapace and have its saliva be a real-time object with actual physics. And after all that, it would still be way less intimidating than the bunker's creature, unless they can also find ways of making your interactions with it more meaningful and interesting. I think that Alien Isolation was an astonishing, bar-setting game in terms of aesthetics and visual immersion, but it was merely good in terms of mechanical immersion, and it was actually pretty average in terms of gameplay depth. It also really suffered from its insistence in dragging on past the point that it had anything new to show the audience. I don't think that I'm ever going to see a game hit a perfect score in my review system, even if I run this channel till the day I die. But if any game is going to have a shot, it would be a game with the aesthetic mastery of Alien Isolation, the mechanical immersion of Amnesia The Bunker, and a runtime that feels sufficient to give you the time to experiment with all of the game's systems, and not as though the runtime itself was the goal. I think that Alien Isolation was a great game, but I don't think that there's any chance whatsoever of its sequel being great. I think that a sequel to Alien Isolation can only be underwhelming or be the stuff of absolute legend. And I think that this will entirely come down to whether the developers try to make the same game with better graphics, or if they go back to the drawing board and fundamentally rework some of its core gameplay mechanics. In short, I don't want Alien Isolation 2 to be any less terrifying than the original game, I just really want it to be a more gripping experience. I want more systems in the game that reward me for thinking about it as though I were there. I want to be frightened by the creature's intelligence and not just by its visual design. More than anything though, I want to have interesting mechanical relationships with the alien, even if that means I end up seeing less of it as a consequence.